Monday, in the evening, and I'm back once again inside Castbox, inside YouTube, and I'm on my Facebook. Going back for my academic integrity, investigating the social world. One, Murji, and the page 30. The module's DD103, investigating the social world. So if you're following the reading, this is like I'd call it an ebook, if you like. It's called an ebook. You haven't got to go and read it for yourself. You can do your artwork. You can listen to it while you're in bed, relaxing. You ain't got to read the pages yourself. All you got to do is listen in. So I'm doing the reading for you. So, it's page 30, chapter 1, exploring home, sociology, social divisions, and social change. Exploring home. Exploring home in sociology pattern, in sociology divisions. Talk about social divisions like ethnicity, age, gender. And power comes in social divisions. Power. Who's got the power? When it comes to the kitchen, the man becomes docile, the woman does all the chores in the kitchen, washing machine, the cooking, ironing, or sometimes the men well, supposedly through network research, a man will do cooking at least, but supposedly. How true that is, I don't know. According to surveys, the survey says, according to the surveys, yes, a man does do cooking at least 3 times a week and wash up. But they do not. 1 out of 5 men use a washing machine because they're idle. Too idle to do the washing machine. To let the woman do the chores. So if any of you relate to that and understand that, please say hello. Put your hand up. It's true to the core facts. Network research is very important in a scientific, sociological world. Anyway, page 30. Domestic technology. The microwave oven. Cooker, dishwasher, and washing machine and others are an example. It is useful to recall how all those have been developed and sold as time and labour-saving devices designed to make housework easier. Yet, sometimes these same devices can be disabling and difficult to use. Not because of the complexity, although recall that Robert, a middle-aged man, said that he couldn't use the washing machine. That was too complicated. There you go. But rather because their design is not always attuned to the needs of different groups of people, such as the elderly. While this is a small-scale qualitative study carried out in England, Maguire et al. 2013 suggests that its findings could be applicable in other countries. Problems with the kitchen technology are not unique to older people and apply to groups of people too, as you may have felt with doing activity 7. Even well-established and quite long-standing technologies such as microwave ovens and washing machines can present difficulties for people with reduced strength and dexterity, or the inability to reach and bend. I've done all this book already. I've read this book. It's my second time I'm reading it. I don't need to read it again. It's getting through the pandemic, isn't it, more than anything? Keep reading, keeping focused, keeping your brain active. The conclusion of the research indicate not only changes in the role of technology in the kitchen, but also change using of space in home overall. Kitchens were recalled by the elderly as communal spaces where a range of activities occurred. However, most of the time the kitchen remained a separate room or space. This is in a stark contrast of designs in kitchens in recent times, which have shifted towards open plan spaces, blended the kitchen and other rooms. Yet the role of the kitchen in the home also appears to show a significant degree of continuity, even if the design and content of space have changed. So, you're looking at an elderly person, disabled person's kitchen. You got the sinks. You want to use a sink. So they've got them sinks now on the where they can like change. They can cut the sink and lower down to his needs of a disability in his wheelchair, so he can do the washing machine, or not the washing machine, the sink rather. Everything's in reach of a man with disability. Everything's lowered down on the shelf, on a mechanism. There you are, a moving mechanism that goes up and down. Anyway, like the bedroom culture of young people, the place of the kitchen in the lives of older people suggests They are both continuities and change in the way that social relationships develop over time and in meanings of home. For most young people studied, the home was a family and communal space shared with other people. For some, the older people, home was a space for one person living alone. Of course, neither young nor old. Age, like all social divisions. Talk about social division at TV. You got man, you got man, you got woman, man and wife, husband and wife. You got children. Maybe you got two boys, two girls. It then becomes a power thing, isn't it? Who's watching what on TV? You got three daughters and one son. The three daughters are overpower that one son because they're gonna be screaming to say, "I'm gonna watch Miss Piggy," or vice versa. If the more sexuality is one concept of men, perhaps boys. Anyway, interest of other divisions, yet for both being an old. Home is also about developing or maintaining some autonomy. For the young, the bedroom provides independence and an adult-free space. For older people, continuing to live their own life, to live their own homes, allows them to attain a measure of independence. In both cases, material objects such as technology. Technology are important to home life. This reinforces the idea of thinking of home space in terms of zones. The arrangement of objects in space reflects the meaning of space in a home. The design to redesign of home spaces and how contemporary living spaces are shaped by ideas of lifestyle. Taste and fashion reveals how people see themselves or wish to be seen, and their relations with other people and with objects in the home. I mean, I've got a bit of a, as you might, I've always had a bit of a distinctive taste to my dress zone. People say that as well. Many people say I've got my own unique, iconic look about myself. But anyway, page 31. It's not about me, it's about a book. The design of homes reflects social codes about appropriate space and activities in different types of people. Generational difference is a social division that can be seen in changing continuing social relations in the home. The use and placement of technology in the home for both younger and older people, it is important in shaping particular meanings of home. We're on page 30, no, we're not on page 32 because that is the end of that chapter. Chapter 2 we're on now. Investigating housing and social policy and crime. Before we go through, I'm going to have a bit of talk before we go through. I've read this, I know what it's about. Investigating housing, social policy and crime. You're looking at moving perhaps. You got crack repairs, you want to move, but you want to make sure there's no crime to where you're going to go. Looking at criminology in the town or the city you're going to move towards. Do you need to move towards the city is it going to be beneficial for your work? Or it's been beneficial for your work but not appropriate for your children's school or activities. You need to be out of the town to be near the school, children's school. You need to make that priority. What is the priority? You getting to work or the children getting education? There you go. Anyway, page 39, introduction. Questioning is a key component of social science investigation. In the previous chapter, you saw this investigate technique applied to the ideal home. Looked at from a sociological point of view. The chapter explored the module theme of inequality through questioning time use and the use of technology in the home. It argued that what happened in the home is linked with wider cultural context and socio-economic conditions and changes. This chapter shifts away from the inner life of the home to investigate the broader social issue of housing through the lenses of social policy and criminology. Specifically, the chapter explores the different ways people gain access to housing and the question of whether certain kinds of housing or housing tenure. For example, whether someone buys their home privately, rents it, or lives in social housing are linked to different social outcomes such as educational attainment, income levels, or higher or lower crime rates. In this chapter, inequality is considered alongside the concept of welfare state. This concept is important because in the United Kingdom in particular, the social science fields of social policy and criminology have traditionally sought to examine social problems alongside different welfare policies. This chapter will demonstrate that. Even though social policy and criminology are concerned with different sets of problems, They often share a common focus of concern and utilise similar strategies of inquiry. Section 1. Social policy and housing investigates the way social policies function in relation to housing, tracing how different policies lead to different results in availability and accessibility of housing. Section 2. Housing. Does housing status matter? Questions whether or not places matter. With respect to a variety of social outcomes, housing and crime and criminology investigates the relationships between housing policy and crime patterns and the question of whether particularly housing policies can make it more or less likely that certain population neighbourhoods are viewed as risky or a prone to criminal activity. And you've got suburban areas, we've got them big like towers, flats, horrible, isn't it? Imagine living in them. Absolute monstrosity. Social policy and housing, page 41. The term social policy tends to refer to three things: the regulation of welfare, social services by the state, and the idea justifying that regulation. The implementation of the state's regulations on welfare and social services in practice. This involves a variety of bodies for private sector companies and non-for-profit organisations and includes informal practice within and between families and individuals. The study of these regulations, ideas and practices. Social policy can be viewed as an argument for or against a particular solution to a particular problem. Social policies, often represented in the form of policy documents and legislation, are produced by or national governments or other regulatory bodies to define a problem and propose a solution to it. The important point is that social policies often define both the problems and the solutions to those problems. These problems and solutions, however, could always be defined differently by different policymakers. Social policy studies are concerned with examining legislation guidelines and activities that promote social ends or objectives. Policies intend to improve the social well-being or social welfare of citizens. Housing is one of the areas affected or influenced by different social and economic policies. The state, charitable organisations and the private sector all play a role in shaping the policy and affect people's access to acquiring housing. Moreover, various levels of government, for example, national or local, can be legally responsible for providing housing. In most countries, their responsibility entails three elements of policy work: the construction, management and maintenance of public housing stock. Establishment and regulation of systems of benefits enabling access to housing. The regulation of private housing markets. So what actually constitutes a housing policy? One answer is that housing policy sets out regulations to manage housing access, allocations and markets. Page 41. Housing, like many social resources, is distributed unequally across between societies. The pattern of that distribution is produced by processes, rules and conventions for how people can access different types of housing, for example, procedures for buying a house, for private letting or eligibility criteria to access social housing. These rules or regulations do not emerge from nowhere, but are made and are changeable. Local and national governments set out regulations and guidance on social or public housing, and the state also regulates many aspects of the private housing market. For example, it establishes minimum building and facility standards, parameters for the legal relationship between landlord and tenant in the rented sector, tax threshold for the sale of housing, incentives for lending institutions or for private companies to build new housing, planning regulations that stipulate where the new developments can and cannot be built, and the provision of government subsidies for the first-time buyers. All these elements can be thought of as promising housing policy. The issue of social housing, however, is not one that tends to be more firmly associated with the state-run schemes, as opposed to private housing markets. While the idea that housing should be accessed through a private housing market is in itself a form of policy, which is an economic policy, this chapter will focus more heavily on social housing policies. Private ownership and housing mortgages will be discussed in chapter 3. Social housing policies, which often tend to be state-run and managed, are intended to ensure that everyone, no matter what their economic circumstances, has access to a safe place to live. The next section begins to discuss the idea of social housing in more detail and considers a brief history of some social housing policies in different countries. Why social housing? A brief history of housing policy. Social, also sometimes referred to as public, housing appeared, in part, as a progressive response to poverty and deterioration of some neighbourhoods, which can result from the rapid change and unpredictability that sometimes occurs as cities develop and evolve. Urban areas that were at one time prosperous and thriving economic centres can fall into decline as industries move on and change. When this happens, high levels of poverty can become concentrated in a particular area of city. Such areas can subsequently become places that people negatively refer to as slums. One way of tackling this problem is for governments to develop social housing policies that move people out of such areas. However, this is only one reason why a social housing policy might be developed. There are a wide variety of other problems that social housing policies might aim to solve. Providing social housing can be seen as one means by which a state may aim to manage populations and to curtail the extent to which people with limited access to housing will become a more serious financial burden. Drawing on other state resources in some countries, including Britain, before the development of social housing policies, the unemployment poor were managed by the state through workhouses or poorhouses. The goal was not to reduce poverty, which was viewed at the time as a normal part of social life. Rather, the workhouse was a place that provided work and shelter for those unable to support themselves. However, such places were meant to encourage people to look for alternative forms of employment and housing because their conditions were deliberately uncomfortable and humiliating. Indeed, these early workhouses were based on similar ideas to those that shaped early prisons in Britain, that the conditions inside the workhouse, or subsequently the prison, should not be better than the conditions of the lowest social class in society. The late 19th and early 20th century saw the development of trade unions and other work-class social movements in the United Kingdom, continental Europe and the United States, in addition to better working conditions, higher wages and paid holidays. One of the central demands of these groups was a broader set of social rewards, including state-subsidised housing. In the UK, charities took the lead in providing workers housing. In the second half of the 19th century, foundations such as the Peabody and the Guinness Trust built housing in London. Local government followed this lead, which the London County Council, for example, building homes in suburban London from the 1880s. UK government followed. With the Housing of the Working Class Act 1885, this gave local authorities the power to close down housing considered unhealthy and set minimum standards for rented housing. However, local authorities were not provided with funds for construction until the Housing Act of 1919. In many countries outside the UK, the state did not take responsibility for housing until the middle of the 20th century. In Hong Kong, for example, social housing only come into being in the 1950s. By the 21st century, half the population lived in such housing in the UK. Much local authority housing is now run by business associations. The provision of clean, safe housing is therefore a subject of social policy. The provision has assumed a number of local forms, including the construction of multi-occupancy buildings, slum clearance, and planned and garden cities and towns. Chandigarh in northern India is an example of a planned city. It is administered by the country's central government. The space has been planned and zoned into a number of sectors, each for various activities, including residential housing. The structure of the entire city is a direct result of policy. Thank you all so much for tuning in. in for a lot of readings, ladies and gents. I am so overwhelmed. We'll be for this book. I'll be back on UK politics in a few days, a couple of days. By what will be Monday, by Friday latest, we'll be hitting UK politics big time. Anyway, page 46. Investigating housing, social policy and crime. Access to housing. Access to housing is ultimately determined by the resources which you have. The more money or capital you have, the more access may be to more than one home. At the other end of the scale, having minimal resources means you cannot buy a home, and therefore you have to rent or attempt to access social housing. In the renting sector, you often have to prove your income as well as pay a deposit worth a number of months rent before you can rent a property. Accumulating this amount of surplus money is a major obstacle to many people and explains why the problems of living in inadequate housing or overcrowded conditions develop. These groups of people who are, in effect, excluded from the home ownership and from the private rented market are those at whom the provision of social housing is often aimed. 1.2.1 Home ownership and social policy. Like the construction and allocation of social housing, home ownership can also be the subject of social policy. Governments can take measures to encourage people to buy homes rather than rent them. An example of this can be found in US history. A major policy established during the Great Depression in the 1930s was a national program of public works and construction. If there was supply, ran the logic, there would also have to be demand. The Federal Housing Administration was established in 1934. Its brief was to extend the opportunity to own homes to a broader section of the population than had previously been the case. Fee underwriting loans due to failures in the banking system in the 1930s. The FHA's role was to exert more control over loans and lower the size of deposits required for house purchase. The FHA has ensured hundreds of millions of dollars worth of state funding for home buyers and the construction of multi-family housing in the period since 1934. It became part of the Department of Housing and Urban Development in 1965. Together, these agencies have insured upwards of 30 million home loans, and during the credit crunch of 2008, they replaced a sizable part of the mortgage lending function of the private sector institutions. The issue of the FHA demonstrates that the field of social policy includes both extending private sector home owning and the provision of social housing. Page 47. Make a list of the organisation and categories of people involved in making housing policy, called actors in social sciences. Discussing these actors you listed should include bodies from the state, such as ministries and possible local authorities, private sector organisations such as construction companies and housing management firms, as well as landlords. And finally, third sector bodies such as charities and housing associations. Each of these plays a role in providing housing and managing its location. 1.22 Connections between housing and other areas of social policy. The areas covered by housing policy interact with private housing market and the benefit system. So one might ask, what role housing policies play more generally in social policy, and why housing is of interest to social scientists studying social policy. Carter and Polchok, 2004, argue that it is important to think of housing and social policy as connected because better quality housing improves the efficiency of a set of other social policy initiatives. They call housing a platform for the success of a host of other social policy areas. For example, in relation to, they suggest that housing advocates must argue, with supporting evidence, that housing expenditures can reduce healthcare costs. Spending money on housing does not take money out of healthcare. It reduces the cost of healthcare. Their main conclusion is that power housing quality leads to power health, so spending on health would be reduced by spending more on high quality housing. Indeed, one of the arguments put forward for social housing in the first place was to help eliminate disease. Yet, Carter and Pochok state the housing policies are not usually coordinated with health policies. This conclusion neatly demonstrates the point of social policy study to identify existing patterns and relate them to policy in order that policy to be made more effective. Page 48. Page 49 is the conclusion. Social policy studies can investigate the issue of housing from a variety of angles. Unmet housing needs, adequacy of housing, regulating the housing market, and how housing links to other areas of policy concerns such as health and education. If one objective of social policy is to promote better social outcomes by introducing policy that reduces inequalities, the study of housing helps provide the data. That would be the basis for any such policies. Page 50. Investigating housing, social policies and crime. Housing does housing status matter? One outcome of social policy making classification of people. According to their housing status, people are placed into three main categories of housing status, which are used in most official statistics. These statistics are the ones collected by government agencies through various surveys. The Office for National Statistics in the UK, for example, one of those European Commissions or European Union. These categories are owner-occupiers, those who are either repaying back a loan on a property or own it outright. Private renters, renting in private sector. Social housing residents, renting in social housing sector, typically at subsidised rates. It is important to note that the proportion of these groups have changed over time due to social policy and the state of the economy, among other things. In the case of the UK, for example, the proportion of people in private rented housing before the First World War was nearly 90%. After laws were passed in 1919 enabling local authorities to build social housing, this figure dropped sharply in 2014. It stood at about 15% back in 2014. The proportion of three groups also differ from one country to another, and a wide variety of cultural, political and economic factors account for differences in proportions. The rest of this section will consider the relationship between what type of housing someone grows up in and outcomes in other areas of life, asking the question, what impact does housing status have on life chances? Ask yourself that question. Think about it. Opportunities, business, if it's pleasure, hobbies. If you're in the right area, around the right people at the right time, you can make something yourself. Exactly, that's what it means, you know. You're in a suburban area. Your son is the best footballer in the world. Could be playing for England if he had the right opportunity. But you're nowhere near where, the top training facilities are, the top scouts, all the top football players are. You need to move. Or business opportunities. You're great within politics, but you're not near Parliament. You don't live near Parliament. You don't live near London. They're not going to hear your voice. Not going to hear your name. Research on housing and life chances. Is there a relationship between a person's housing status and various outcomes such as educational attainment, income level, health and wealth? As wealth typically determines one's access to housing, one would expect to find statistically significant patterns. Page 51. Ruth Lupton and her team, Lupton et al. 2009, compared the housing status and social outcomes of four generations of people born between 1946 and 2000. The data was collected from people living in England, Wales and Scotland. The 2000 sample also included people living in Northern Ireland. Lupton et al. Accessed data on samples of people born in 1946. The National Survey for Health and Development, 1958. The National Child Development Study, 1970. The British Cohort Study, and 2000 Millennium Cohort Study. The results revealed that for the group born in 1946, social housing was usually a step up from private renting and a stepping stone towards home ownership. This finding, however, only remained stable for a period of about 10 years. For people born in 1958, this pattern was not as strong, as more people had begun to move out of social housing and into home ownership. For people born in 1970 and 2000, the status of social housing has deteriorated and was no longer an improvement on private rented accommodation. Thus, data from the first cohort of the study, those from 1946 sample, suggest that social housing provided an attractive housing option for people of all social classes. However, the data from the later cohort revealed that the status of social housing had eroded by 1958 and become a housing option for more for disadvantaged populations rather than households with average or above average earnings. The key finding from Lupton et al. Study was that on average, those who lived in social housing as children were worse off as adults in terms of health, well-being, education and employment for their peers. The finding was true from the generation 1958 and 1970, and the results also suggest a familiar trajectory for the cohort from 2000. Housing status and social outcomes. There are different variables that demonstrate a shift in the profile of social housing residents since the Second World War, according to Lupton. In 1946, around 1 in 3 households owned their own homes. It was commonplace for people for every social class to live social housing because of the high quality and wide availability. This form of housing, in fact, almost 1 in 6, 15% of the country's wealthiest 20%, lived in social housing, along with more than 1 in 4, 27% of the poorest 20%. This page 52, investigating housing social policy crime. By 2005, only 2%, 1 in 50 of the wealthiest 20%, and almost 49% of the poorest 20% lived in social housing. These changes are in part due to change in social policies that shape the kinds of housing available. In their longitude study, Lupton et al. Sought to control for other differences between households in order to determine whether housing would still have an impact. Controlling means that researchers built in calculations that took into consideration different variables such as parents, education, occupation, income and interest in education, teachers, rating of child's progress, whether the child was bullied, how happy the child was, whether they wet the bed, their height and weight, and for the 1958 and 1970s cohorts, characteristics of their schools. And it is rattling in your brains as I'm reading through. I mean, it has me quite a hell of a lot for various reasons. Thinking, life growing up and to what it was then and to what it is now. Things are changing slightly for the better, but not quite. No one's living a lavish lifestyle. When they applied these controls, Lupton et al. Found these housing statuses had no defect on social outcomes from the 1946 cohort. In other words, growing up in social housing had no independent negative or positive effect for that group. However, for the children, in the examples born in 1950 and 1970, housing status did have a significant impact on latter life outcomes, even after controlling for other factors that might have both restricted their opportunities and forced them to rent. Social housing might make social housing more desirable. Two people from all social classes as a visible, viable housing choice for all social class members. Social housing may have the capacity to level the playing field or make people's life chances and outcomes more likely to be equal. However, if social housing is instead implemented only as a positive for poor and disadvantaged, it may have a negative effect on the people with no alternative but to access this form of housing. Thus, overall, the findings show that the effects of growing up in social housing on the generation born in 1946 were neutral, But those born in 1958 and 1970 emerged worse off in all measures. So what can be made of the survey's conclusions? The authors are careful not to stipulate the differences in outcomes were caused by childhood experiences of social housing, because it is difficult to isolate one factor out of so many and attribute as a causal effect to it. While there is evidence that child development and health are affected by social housing status, the relationship between housing, inequality and social outcome needs further research to determine what matters in relation to housing policy. This complicated answer requires thinking about the role that social housing performs, discussing similar trends in relation to council housing. In general, Jonathan and Ungerson write that the social housing sector changed from catering from the neat and tidy in the post-war generation to providing for the tight and needy by the turn of the century. Of course, people's life chances are not completely determined by the sort of housing they live in. By considering the relationship between different housing policies, social outcomes and changing patterns over time in the types of housing available and who is able to access it suggests interconnections between policies and outcomes that might not be immediately obvious. Activity 2. After looking at the key findings from Lupton et al. Longitudinal survey on the relationship between housing status and life chances, make a short list of factors you think could contribute to explaining this relationship. Now, which ones do you think are the most important, and what kinds of further evidence would you need to argue your case? Looking for the right question to ask and trying to interpret the answers and are the basis of the social sciences do, there is not usually a simple answer. Sometimes finding the right question is the most difficult part of the process. Often the questions are driven by the recognition of inequalities and seeking to understand what process leads to them or worsen them. If certain social housing policies are sometimes associated with negative outcomes, how does society move to more equitable policies? It is important to realise that social science can rarely be absolute in its claims of knowledge. This is not a weakness, but a recognition of the complexities of social world. In the summary, classifying people into housing categories is a technical device to implement policy or collect statistics. It is not intended to have any meaning beyond that. However, it is worth noting that social policy sets some of the parameters that determine how people get categorised, and these categories have real, material, measurable impact on people's life chances. While research has established statistically significant relationships between housing status and other outcomes, such as health, employment, and educational attainment, the degree to which the outcomes are caused by housing status is not clear. Housing status may be part of a more complicated pattern. Page 55, I mean, if you guys are listening and you are doing your module DD103, take note. You know, I'm reading, I lay in bed, I can press play on my YouTube, listen to what I've just read back time and time again. So when I read this book, I've read this book twice, this is my second time I read it. So when I read the book back and when I listen to what I've just read, what I do is press rewind, press play. You know, it's a no-brainer. Do my artwork, press play. I can sit in the House of Commons with my headphones on, press play. I can sit or, you know, be painting a fence, put my headphones on, listen to what I just read. Housing crime and criminology. The study of criminology and social policy eliminates the difference that policies can make to understand of crime. Criminology can be defined as a study of crime and also criminal justice, even though criminology can include the study of a wide range of topics, issues and problems that relate to crime. It is often focused on questioning and understanding the social, political and economic factors that influence the way ideas of crime and criminal justice are defined differently in different times and places. People will wonder why I took myself out of a categorised urban area full of urban, you know, degenerated idiots, because I'm bettering myself for my well-being and for the well-being of my children. And that's what matters in life. Be the best parent you can be. Criminologists who want to identify the linkage between social policy and rates of crime, imprisonment or victimisation often attempt to account for the social, political or economic conditions that make certain types of crime or other forms of social harm. For example, eco-crime, corporate crime or state crime, more or less likely to occur. Criminologist Leon Razin with 1906 to 1999 argued that identifying a single causal factor for the problems of crime was a wasted effort. Nepar 2007. Instead, he suggested that the most that can be done is to throw light upon the combination of factors or circumstances associated with crime. Criminology in the UK has broadly speaking considered problems of crime alongside or in relation to social welfare is concerned. This means that crime is considered alongside social issues such as levels of poverty, unemployment rates, availability of safe housing or education opportunities. However, there is no single preferred approach to investigating or theorising problems of crime among criminologists. The concept of crime is itself contested and changeable. What is viewed as crime in one society may not be in another. Even in the same society, views about what activities are legal can change over time. Can you think of any activities that are legal in the UK but were once legal? What about male homosexuality? That was not discriminated in England and Wales until the passing of Sexual Offences Act 1967. Decriminalised in Scotland through the Criminal Justice Scotland Act 1980 in Northern Ireland, through homosexual offences in Northern Ireland in order in 1982. This shift can also happen in other directions. Activities there can be legal made and illegal. Legal can be made illegal. One example in England and Wales is the ban on smoking in public places, which came in effect on the 1st of July 2007. Thus, it can be said that the concept of crime is socially, historically and geographically constructed. In other words, what is considered a crime in any given society depends on where you are and on the social or cultural conventions of the society you're in. Muncie et al. 2010 up page 8 argue that what we view as a crime also depends on who has the power, both to define what crime is and to mobilise powers of enforcement against those deemed to have committed such a violation of the law. It is evident then that a crime is a rather slippery concept. The study of crime, criminology, is in part concerned with questioning and evaluating social, political and economic factors that influence the way ideas of crime and criminal justice are defined differently and different locations. Research studies and theories of crime from one country or jurisdiction to rested to establish if findings are generalisable to other social contexts, meaning they reveal reliable social patterns. The rest of this chapter will focus and examine relationships between crime and housing, and on questions of whether particular housing policies make it more or less likely for more people or neighbourhoods to be seen at risk for criminal activity. Section 3.1 considers the influential work of a group of urban sociologists and criminologists from the 1920s and 1930s, who formed the Chicago School. Their work established what became new as an ecological theories of crime, which suggests that the environment in which people live and interact shows some association with crime rates. Section 3.2 then discusses the way links between housing and crime rates were investigated by the UK criminologists in answer to their US counterpart. Section 3.3 it moves on to consider how some social problems come to criminalise that it is become a criminal justice issue opposed to the social policy issue. Page 57, Housing, Crime and Criminology. 3.1, Chicago School and Social Disorganisation Theory. Chicago slums. This is the city of Chicago in the 19th and early 20th century was growing at a rapid rate. Social scientists worked in Chicago University during the 1920s and 1930s become interested in a way that urban development or city researchers, most notably Robert A.R. Park and Ernest W. Burgess, were concerned with developing and testing the idea of ecological theory of human behaviour, which proposed association between human behaviour, society structures and physical environmental factors. To test these ideas, they engaged in empirical research using a variety of research strategies, including social surveys, analysis of census data, and field research involving interviews and observations. Page 58. The first systematic study of social life in Chicago indicated that the residential areas of the city seemed to be divided along the line of class, ethnicity, housing type, and housing tenancy. Park and Burgess developed what is known as a concentric zone mode to illustrate the way different urban environments and social structures tend to cluster in the city. According to the research, this model, also known as the Burgess model, was a representation of natural progression and makes place in cities as residential and commercial areas evolve, change and develop. The core circle of the model represented the central business area of the city zone 1. The first inner ring outside the centre zone 2 was what Park and Burgess called a zone of transition. This zone was an area categorised by instability, turbulence and, in places, urban decline. Page 59. Page 59. Last but not least. This part of the city tended to include a mixture of both factories and power equality or derelict residential housing. It was often occupied by set workers, people with gang affiliations and drug users, as well as by successive groups and improvised migrant populations moving into the city from rural areas. For a southern state or other, mostly European countries, different ethnic culture groups, Irish, Polish and Italian, successfully settled and then moved through this district. As they worked their way up to more affluent circles, being replaced by the next wave of poor migrant settlers. The housing in the areas was not well maintained because many property owners have purchased residential buildings on speculation. That is, with the expectation that properties in these areas would eventually become highly sought after and would increase in value. However, in the interim, the landlords would not maintain the properties or convert them into more stable homes and would instead rent them out to the short-term tenancies, moving to boot. Moving outward from a transition zone was a slightly more affluent zone characterised by single-family tenant housing for working-class labourers. Suburban middle-class housing was further out from the centre zone 4, and housing occupied by the rich was located in the outermost areas of the city, where there was a space for larger properties. I'll do this last page. How about that? Page 60. Investigating housing, social policy and crime. Chapter 2. So following the module DD103. Hello, Murji. Building on the work of Park Burgess, criminologists Shaw and McKay in 1931-1942 become interested in relationships between crime rates in the different residential areas. To investigate this relationship, the researchers estimated juvenile delinquency and crime rates alongside other statistical data about the social structure of populations in each zone, as measured by demographic data such as income, ethnicity and age. Conducting analysis of data from over 20 large US cities, Shaw and McKay found crime rates followed a uniform pattern and were highest in the transition zones, zone 2 in figure 2.8. Adjacent to central business districts, they also found that high crime rates remained consistent in the areas over time, despite the fact that they had a high rate of population turnover. Given what you have read above, can you think of some reason that a transition zone in the city might have higher rates of reported crime in the other areas? Even when the population within the transition zone is constantly changing. As you'll read below, there could be many reasons for this, and up to the present day, there is no one theory that can provide a single or reliable set of causal determining factors for the presence or absence of criminal activity among a given population. Remember the statement made by Westmisnter that you read earlier at the start of this section. The most that can be done is to throw light upon a combination of factors or circumstances associated with crime. That's 2 hours done reading, so I'm going to give it a break because blood vessels can burst around my eyes. The concentration. Thank you for listening on YouTube. That is Tony, as you're always listening. Appreciate it. Thank you, mate. Everyone on Facebook, hello, God bless. Castbox, you listeners.